In this video, we're going to go over the emergency December 1st, 2022 ban list, explaining why each card was hit and also how the game will change because of it. The first of the two banned cards is Curious the Lightsworn Dominion. This is a Link 3 Light Warrior monster and takes 3 monsters with the same attribute but different types as its materials. This card's first effect is that when it's Link summoned, you can just send any card from your deck to the graveyard. Additionally, when a card is sent from your deck to the graveyard by a card effect, it mills the top 3 cards of your deck. And lastly, it also has a floating effect, where if it's destroyed by battle or leaves the field because of an opponent's card effect, you get to target a card in your graveyard and add it back to your hand. Now, Curious is one of the strongest Link monsters to be printed ever. Being able to send any card from your deck to the graveyard can be overwhelmingly powerful for a number of decks, and is something that has landed many other cards on the ban list before, such as Lavalval Chain. The only thing that held this card back was its awkward summoning requirement, needing 3 monsters of the same attribute but different types to be brought out. This kept Curious from being splashed in most decks, and it was mostly relegated to 60 card grass decks, which had an easier time going into it. However, all of this changed when the Danger archetype came out. The Dangers are a series of monsters which can special summon themselves for free most of the time, and also help you dig deeper into the deck by making you draw a card when they come out. But the part that really mattered for Curious was that they were all dark attribute, with each having a different type. Since Dark is the most plentiful attribute in the game, with plenty of powerful playstarters by itself, and the fact that the Danger archetype actually packed quite some uncommon types led Curious to being splashable in way more decks than ever before. This card became a staple in many strategies which use Dangers, and was more often than not paired with its biggest partner in crime, Nightmare Griffin. This is a generic Link 4 monster which can be made with 2 or more monsters with different names, so you can just make it with Curious and one other material. It prevents non-Link special summon monsters from activating their effects, and when it's Link summoned, you can pitch a card from your hand to set a spell trap from your graveyard to your field, but it can't be activated this turn. So what people often did with these 2 cards was send really broken floodgates to the grave with Curious, such as Imperial Order when it was legal, and then use Griffin to set it to your field. This was enough to get people rallying for this card's banning during several formats, as whenever Curious came into the meta, it was always to do some degenerate combo like this. Still, it was a limitation of several Dangers which kept this kind of thing in check in the end. The latest instance of a tier 1 deck using Curious was in Danger Tellarknight strategy. The Tellarknight cards fit extremely well with Curious, as the monsters trigger their effects to fusion summon using materials from the graveyard, hand, or field, and the back row lets you add cards to your hand when sent to the graveyard. The release of the TCG exclusive fusion monster Garura Wings of Resonant Life also played quite a big role, since it's quite easy to make within the archetype. You only need Garura, a Tellarknight monster, and a Danger to go into Curious. To top it all off, by making Curious with Garura, you chain block Curious's mill effect with Garura's floating effect, protecting you from hand traps such as Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. This card was particularly vicious in tier because you didn't even have to link it to Griffin for it to provide interaction, as its effective mill 3 could also be triggered during your opponent's turn when paired with other tier cards. The last iterations of Danger tier took a significant amount of top cut slots during the September 2022 format due to their explosiveness and resilience to hand traps. With all that said, by the time the ban list dropped, Curious had completely fallen out of the meta. The release of more tier limit support as well as other generic action deck options had pushed the Danger variant out of the meta for the most part already. The release of the new Ishizu support, which ushered the game into a tier 0 format, made it completely extinct though. There's no reason to play a tier variant other than Ishizu tier at the moment, which doesn't really need any help milling cards in the first place. It's a bit puzzling why Konami would end up choosing now of all times to ban Curious, since they could have done it back during the September 22 ban list when it was actually being played. This ban doesn't really affect the current meta, but since Curious is pretty much always being used in the most degenerate strategies available at any given time, it's not a bad hit at all. The second and last banned card is Mystic Mine. This is a field spell which makes it so the player who controls more monsters than the other cannot activate monster effects or declare attacks. However, during the end phase, if both players control the same amount of monsters, it destroys itself. Mine is easily one of the most controversial cards in the game's history, being even more hated within the Western community than the also highly controversial Max C. Mystic Mine is simply the best floodgate we've had available since Vanity's Emptiness, and it warped the meta just as much as that card did. When Mine first came out, it initially found a home in Sky Striker decks, which can comfortably play in a Cure Advantage until you lose the game. But there were also the much more infuriating Pure Mine decks, which aimed to activate Mine to lock you out, making sure it couldn't be removed by using defensive cards and giving your opponent's monsters, and then slowly burning you to death. But Mine was not only played in these decks, as with time it only picked up more and more traction as a great going second card. By bringing in Mine against a board that had no spell trap negates, or which had already used theirs, you could just activate it and then just pass back to your opponent until they decked out. The existence of Mine and the very real possibility of a deck out loss led to numerous decks having to splash in random pieces of back row removal such as Cosmic Cyclone in their main deck just so they wouldn't instantly lose to this card being activated. This card promoted extremely toxic game states, but even more so in real life events, as even if you did have an out, all the turns it might take you to draw into it might force you to go into time later on. This card was very often played as a one-of in decks with field spells to turn terraforming and set rotation into going second options. The most successful Mine decks throughout time ended up being Sky Striker and Altergeist, both control strategies which could poke your opponent under Mine, and then remove their own monsters with in-engine options to ensure you'd always have less cards. This card being around changed how people built both their decks and their boards, and while it did fall off the meta at some points, it always come back feeling stronger than ever before. In the past few metas, this card has been a staple in flu decks, as well as decks that tend to perform board breakers over hand traps that aren't Dimensional Shifter. It was also popular in some sprite variants, which could play around one of outs to Mine, such as Galaxy Cyclone, by protecting their Mine with Beat Con to the Underworld. Another notable example of a deck that could use Mine as a win con is Pure Runic, which goes for the deck out better than any other Mine deck before, as it can thin your opponent's deck and get rid of their removal with their Runic spells. Mystic Mine was actually hit fairly quickly in the OCG, going to 1 not long after its release over there, where it stayed for a couple years until eventually it got banned before Master Rule 5 even came into effect. The fact that this card spent as long as it did unrestricted in the TCG made many players think it'd be a staple of our format forever, as time and time again, people would ask for it to get banned only for it to stay unscathed again year after year. Most people had probably lost all hope as it went through September's list at 3 once again, even though many tournament winners were playing in their decks, and a recent YCS winner was even on a pure Mine strategy. However, to everyone's surprise once again, this list switch came out of nowhere also addressed one of the longest lasting problems in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Mine wasn't that much of an issue at the moment, as the best deck of the format, Ishizu Tier, doesn't really struggle with it due to having access to Perla Reyno's Pop, as well as an in-arc type back row removal. However, it'd just be a matter of time until it came back into the meta again. But thankfully, that's not the case anymore, as it went straight from 3 to 0 in one fell swoop. If there's one card which both the competitive and casual communities won't ever miss, it's certainly Mystic Mine. And now, with our only limit, we have Herald of Orange Light, going from 3 to 1. This is a level 2 tuner light fairy monster, which has the effect that, when your opponent activates a monster effect, you can send it and one other fairy monster from your hand to the graveyard to negate the activation and destroy that card. Herald is actually quite an old card that's seen some scattered play throughout the years. It has spell and trap card negate counterparts in green and purple light. Those weren't nearly as relevant as orange, since decks have mostly been relying on monster effects since forever now. In the past, it was a staple in Agents and sometimes saw play in World Chalice variants playing Venus. However, this card's first big break would be in Drytron. These decks would abuse Cyber Angel Ben 10's non-once per turn graveyard effect to search you a fairy from your deck, as well as Eva's floating effect to get you some fairies from the grave to load your hand with monsters from that type. These could then be spent as fodder for Herald of Ultimateness's negate effect, which when Drytron was at full power, was often able to negate as many cards as your opponent had drawn in their opening hand. Orange Light played quite a few roles in Drytron. Not only was it a potent hand trap going second, it was also a very powerful defensive tool against hand traps such as DD Crow and Ally of Justice Cycle Reader going first. At last, this card was great in playing around cards which could disable your heralds, such as Kaijus and Dark Ruler No More, as even if they got rid of it, odds are you'd still have a couple of orange lights in your hand to back up your board anyways. But while it was one of the harder things to play around when dealing with the deck, Drytron's power would eventually be put in check by limitation of Ben 10 and banning of Eva anyways. But this card would once again come into the meta with Ishizu Tier. Since the Ishizu monsters are all fairy monsters, it means you're playing around 10 monsters which can be coupled with Herald for a negate by default. To make matters even worse, all of the Ishizu monsters have incredible effects in the graveyard. Either they mill 5 cards off of both players' decks when they hit the graveyard, allowing you to play during your opponent's turn with tier cards, or they can banish themselves at quick effect speed from the graveyard to shovel back 3 cards from either graveyard into the deck. A live orange light threatens multiple interactions during either player's turn and can easily end the turn of a rogue deck such as Sprite. To add fuel into the fire, this is also one of the best ways for tier players to deal with Dimension Shifter, which banishes all cards that would be sent to the graveyard for 2 turns. At last, the presence of this card in the deck also made it easier to go into Baron de Fleur, since it can be brought back from the graveyard with Sprite Elf, and you can then synchro it off with Predaplan Dragos Depalia or Rukalos to go into Baron. While this card going to 1 won't change the playstyle or power the deck much at all, it's still quite a nice boon for non-tier Ishizu decks as they won't instantly lose because of an orange light on their starter anymore. And now, for the only card being semi-limited, we have Lyrilusc Recital Starling, going from 1 to 2. This is a rank 1 Wind Wingbeast Xyz monster which takes 2+ level 1s to be made. On Xyz summon, it can target a face-up monster in the field to make it gain 300 attack for each material attached to this card. In addition, all battle damage you take from battles involving this card is also inflicted to your opponent. Once per turn, it can detach material to add a level 1 Wingbeast monster from your deck to your hand. This card was limited quite a few formats ago as a way to keep Tri-Brigade Lyrilusc in check. The Lyrilusc engine was often used to go into double Recital Starling to get 2 searchers. With that done, you could then use both of them to go into Utopic Draco Future, which can negate and steal a monster. So not only were you going massively plus by having access to 2 of this card, you were also getting a very good monster to protect the rest of your Tri-Brigade plays from cards like Effect Veiler and Nibiru the Primal Being. Ultimately, while Tri-Brigade Lyrilusc was a formidable deck at the time, it's unlikely to do anything now. It loses hard to Ishizu engine shufflers, and doesn't have access to Sigmorg, Bird of Sovereignty anymore, its other boss monster. And now for the unlimits. We have quite a few of them. First of all, we have Tellarknight Ptolemaeus. This is a light warrior rank 4 XCs which takes 2 or more level 4 monsters to be made. It can, during either player's turn, detach 3 materials from itself to rank up into any rank 5 XCs monster from your extra deck. Its other effect is that it can detach 7 materials in order to skip your opponent's next turn. Also, during each player's end phase, it can attach a Stellar Knight card from your extra deck to itself as a material. Ptolemaeus was banned due to its ability to rank up to Cyber Dragon Nova, which could then go into Cyber Dragon Infinity, which is Omni Negate. This was extremely powerful in 2016 or so, as Omni Negates weren't that easy to come by, and you didn't have anything else better to do with excess level 4 monsters in the field most of the time. This combo is probably not going to be seen any play these days, as not only does it take a lot of field investment, it also takes up 3 extra deck spots. There's just way better stuff you could be using 3 monsters on the field for these days, especially when you take link monsters into account. Most of the time, you're going to be putting a much bigger dent into your opponent's strategy by using the rank 4 floodgates we have, such as Baguska and Abyss Dweller anyways. People have been saying Ptolemaeus could come off the ban list for years now, and unless a new broken rank 5 monster is released anytime soon, it's unlikely this will change anything in the grand scheme of things. There are some interesting things you can do with this card, such as going into Stellar Knight Constellar Diamond, which prevents your opponent from milling cards from the deck while it has material, and it can negate a Dark Monster's effect by detaching a material. While this does seem like a tailor-made counter to tier limits, once again, it is much harder to get off and probably much less impactful than if you just went into Abyss Dweller instead. Next up, we have Fire Formation Tenki, going from 2 to 3. This is a continuous spell which grants your Beast Warrior monsters 100 attack on activation, and it lets you search a level 4 or lower Beast Warrior monster from your deck to your hand. There's not much to say on this one, as it's just Konami rolling back its hits to Tri-Brigade. This one was more targeted at the Zodiac variants at the time. While this card still has plenty of good search targets such as Tri-Brigade Fractal, going from 2 to 3 offers such a small consistency boost it's barely worth talking about. Then we have Metaverse, going from 1 to 3. This is a normal trap which can either add to your hand or activate a field spell straight from your deck. Metaverse was limited because of its interaction with Mystic Mine, as you could just set Metaverse and wait until your opponent dropped a monster down to mine them out of the game. While there are still plenty of good field spells out there with many of them being floodgates just like Mine, this card isn't nearly as scary as it was with Mine in the format. With that said, Metaverse at 3 might actually see quite a bit of play, since this card can in theory be used to bring out either Necro Valley to counter tier limits or Zombie World to counter Fluent Reese. Since these two are shaping up to be the best and second best strategies of the format respectively, it might be something rogue decks fall back on when it comes to the side deck. And last, we have both Dimension Fissure and Macrocosmos going from 1 to 3. These cards are very similar from each other and serve mostly the same purpose, with Fissure making it so all monsters get banished instead of going to the graveyard, and Macro doing it for all cards but as a trap instead of a spell. These two cards have been on the list at 1 for a while now, on account of them being both extremely obnoxious floodgates. Almost every deck that comes out these days probably relies on the graveyard in some way. There's a very good reason why it's been referred to as the second hand for years now after all. The removal of this card from the Forbidden list has a very clear intent, to try and give people more tools to fight against the graveyard-reliant tier 0 threat, Ishizu tier, without having to hit the deck directly. Though it's up for anyone's guess as to how good these two will be at doing it, as it's unlikely that the deck will stop being tier 0 just because they're at 3 now. The OCG has always had these two at 3, and tier limits still dominate over there anyways. Macrocosmos just serves as a pretty good trap to side in versus tier, though many cards such as Soul Drain and Different Dimension Ground also fulfill the same role already. Dimensional Fissure is definitely the more relevant of the two, as it can be activated when going second and will turn off many effects if it goes through. Still, it's outed just as easily as Mine and Necro Valley were due to the existence of Pale Reno, so it's not like it's going to act as a silver bullet against the strategy. This card is definitely a nice boost for Fluent Reese decks though, which can easily slot in place of 3 Mystic Mines they just lost, and it makes their engine more resilient while also locking tiers out of the game. Alright, and that was the December 2022 ban list. This was a very unusual list that kind of came out of nowhere. Maybe Konami had planned this in advance, as the previous ban list was almost a month overdue, or maybe they're going to be shifting from big, impactful ban lists to more frequent, smaller ones. If there's one thing we can be sure of, is that Ishizu tier limits is still going to be tier 0 despite the small slap on the wrist it got. If you have any thoughts on this list, or know of anything we missed when talking about the cards here, be sure to let us know down in the comments below.